viewers. In this video, I'm going to be talking about cults, specifically how we differentiate cults and religions. And this is a video I've kind of been procrastinating over for some time now, because I realize that what I'm talking about can be quite a contentious issue. Everyone seems to have their own idea of how the word cult should be applied, and so it can be quite an emotional issue to talk about. So I wanted to kind of take some time to really think about how to express myself in a video on this issue, having already written about it in my book. And here goes. So before I begin, I have 3 disclaimers to make. First of all, as should be obvious in all of my videos, these are just my opinions offered on a take it or leave it basis. I realize that some of what I'm going to say may be offensive to some people, but you have to understand that I'm just speaking honestly. This is how I honestly and genuinely view this issue. Speaking as someone who is no longer religious and doesn't hold a candle for any particular system of religious belief. Secondly, let it be known that I think the word cult is problematic when you're trying to engage in discourse with people who are perhaps in a cult, which is why I try to use it sparingly in my videos. I don't completely avoid using it, because my videos are not just for people who are in cults. They're not just for people who are indoctrinated. Really, they're mainly for people who are figuring out that they've been in a cult and they need some kind of information to guide them through their journey. And I try to treat all of my audience like adults and say it like it is. I like to think that you guys appreciate that about my videos. So I will occasionally refer to, for example, Jehovah's Witnesses as a cult, but I recognize that if I was speaking one-on-one with a Jehovah's Witness, that would be the last word that I should consider using if my aim is to persuade them and to reach out to them and establish some sort of dialogue. Thirdly, I think it's worth pointing out that when people have this conversation, sometimes it's with the aim of discussing whether a particular group or a particular religious organization is entitled to tax-exempt status. And I think that that's a different conversation entirely. In my personal opinion, organizations should be tax exempt if they offer charitable giving to anyone, regardless of what their religious beliefs are, and without having any ulterior motives. That for me is the pure essence of what a charity is. I personally don't think you should be tax exempt just for being a religion. What you're doing is you are basically providing a service or a product to people who want to believe a certain way that benefits really just that group of people. I don't see why that kind of thing should be tax exempt. But if a religion were operating a charity that again was making its services available to anyone who was in need, then that should be tax exempt. So those are my thoughts on tax exemption, which again is a different discussion. With all those disclaimers out of the way, perhaps it would be useful, since we're talking about words, to look at the dictionary definitions of religion and cult. And to help us with this, I've put together this graphic which shows at a glance the definitions, or the different definitions for religion and cult, depending on which dictionary you decide to use. So I've included Google, Cambridge, Collins, Merriam-Webster, and the Oxford Dictionary. And what's interesting is that when you look at the definitions for religion, you notice they're pretty much all in agreement. So we start off with Google saying that religion is the belief in and worship of a superhuman controlling power, especially a personal god or gods. Cambridge pretty much agrees and says, or any such system of belief and worship. Same thing with Collins, but they include praying and worshipping in a building such as a church or temple. Merriam-Webster, the service and worship of God or the supernatural. And Oxford, the belief in and worship of a superhuman controlling power, same thing as what Google said, a particular system of faith and worship. So all of the definitions for religion are pretty much in agreement there. There's no real contradiction or conflict. It's slightly different, however, when we look at the definitions that are given for cult. So Google says a system of religious veneration and devotion directed towards a particular figure or object. Interesting that figure or object is in the singular, which would seem to discount religious veneration of a group of individuals or a group of leaders or a group of objects. The Cambridge definition says a religious group often living together. I found that odd. Why? What does living together have to do with it, really? But anyway, they say often living together whose beliefs are considered extreme or strange by many people. And this, I'm going to just labour on this point because this is basically at the crux of the problem here. Who gets to decide what's extreme and who gets to decide what's strange? That's the main problem with applying the word cult, because it's a pejorative. It's basically an insult. If I say to someone, you're in a cult, I'm basically insulting them. I'm applying a pejorative to something that they value or deem to be precious. But here the Cambridge Dictionary is saying, oh, well, you get to use that word if you think that the beliefs are extreme or strange. Well, again, who gets to arbitrate whether beliefs are strange or not? I could say it's strange to worship a god with the head of an elephant or with the resemblance of an elephant. Does that mean that Hinduism is a cult? Would I go up to a Hindu and say, your religion is objectively a cult because you believe in a god that looks like an elephant, and that's strange? It would be problematic to do that because I'm basing it purely on my perception of what is or isn't strange. So that's the main problem with the word cult. We're dealing with people's opinions rather than with objective facts. And if we move on to Collins, we get another interesting twist. A fairly small religious group, especially one which is considered strange. So we get the strange thing again, and we also get this a fairly small. So as long as it's a fairly small religion, we get to call it a cult. And I'm going to kind of go into this in a bit more detail very shortly, but what does the size have to do with anything? So we're saying that if a cult can get enough followers, at some point it's going to cross this threshold in membership where it starts to be a religion. I don't quite buy that. Either it's a cult or it isn't. It doesn't make any difference to me how popular it is. So that's an interesting one. And then Merriam-Webster says a religion regarded as unorthodox or spurious. Again, who gets to decide what is or isn't spurious, what is or isn't unorthodox? And then Oxford says, and I've included, by the way, a bit more of the definition because I think it's really fascinating. I actually quote this definition in my book. a system of religious veneration and devotion directed towards a particular figure or object. Again, we have this assumption that the leadership is in the singular rather than in the plural. A relatively small group of people, again, what does the size have to do with anything? Having religious beliefs or practices regarded by others as strange or as imposing excessive control over members. Well, I can definitely agree with the imposing excessive control. I think that's something that's almost universal in cults, as I understand the meaning of the word cult, is that cults are interested in controlling people. But again, who gets to decide what is or isn't strange? We could look at the Catholic Church as one of the world's biggest religions. You can't complain about the size of the Catholic Church. You can't say it's unorthodox if it's one of the world's biggest religions. And yet they have, as part of their traditions, a ceremony in which, by eating a piece of paper, they believe that they are eating part of the body of Christ, transubstantiation, which I think is very strange, or probably lots of people would consider to be strange. Oh, you're eating part of Jesus's body by eating a piece of paper. That's weird, but would you, on that basis, call Catholicism a cult? Just on that basis? It's really tricky, and this is why, although I try to base everything I say when we're being objective about things, I try to base everything I say on the dictionary definition. When we look at the dictionary definition of cult, we see numerous different definitions, all of which don't make a great deal of sense. And in my book, I quote from Sam Harris, who did a podcast on this subject, and he said something very interesting, going back to what I was saying before about the numbers, the population of the cult.
So one can use cults as a kind of lens through which to view the phenomenon of the true believer. And of course, every religion is a kind of cult. It just has more subscribers. That's how we differentiate cults and religions. If you have millions of subscribers, you're a religion. If you have 1,000, or in this case, 40, you're a cult.
Which takes us back to what I was saying earlier. What's the threshold where a cult grows to a sufficient number where this kind of lever gets switched and, oh, now it's a religion? We should no longer refer to this as a cult, because enough people believe it, enough people follow it, it now gets to call itself a religion. I don't follow that logic. Which finally, you'll be glad to hear, brings me to what I think is the difference between a cult and a religion, which is nothing. And I realize this will offend lots of people, but I believe that the word cult is just a pejorative word, an insult, that could be used of pretty much every religion. Every religion has beliefs that others consider strange. Every religion has a leadership, either dead or alive, that is an object of veneration to the followers. And every religion has some degree of control over its followers, over what its followers think, over what its followers believe. Now again, I feel terrible saying this because I realize I'm inevitably going to be offending lots of people watching this video who are religious, who go to a particular church, who identify with a particular religion, who will inevitably be saying, are you seriously telling me, Lloyd, that I'm in a cult, that I'm a cult follower just because I happen to follow a particular religion? And my answer is yes, but. And the but is important, okay? I think that all religions are cults, but I think that you can have soft cults and extreme cults. And when we're talking extreme cults, we're talking ISIS, we're talking people being radicalized to commit acts of terror. We're talking groups like Scientology and Jehovah's Witnesses that rip apart families, that cover up abuse, that in the case of Jehovah's Witnesses persuade people to die if a certain medical procedure conflicts with the faith. These are extreme cults. Not all religion clearly has that amount of harm and abuse inside its beliefs and practices. It's perfectly obvious to me that many religions are nowhere near that harmful. But they do have some harm, and this is the point which I'm going to try to explain to you in a slightly different way, which I've been thinking about, okay? So we're talking about cult and religion. Cult, as I've said, is an insult. Religion is just an objective term that you would apply to any group that has a certain set of religious beliefs that could be defined as venerating a supernatural entity, let's say, for the sake of argument. Let's switch that up, and instead of talking about cults and religions, let's talk about assholes and people. So you can say Lloyd Evans is a person. You're just making an objective statement of fact. You could also say Lloyd Evans is an asshole. And I would agree with you, because I think to at least some extent, everyone's an asshole. I've met literally maybe a handful of people in my life where I can detect 0% asshole because they are just so weirdly nice all the time and never say anything negative about anyone. I can maybe think of a handful of people who I've known well about whom that's true. But I think we all do things that we regret. We all say things or behave in ways that cause other people to be hurt or offended needlessly. And I am certainly no exception. So even though it would probably be extreme to refer to me as an asshole, I'm certainly capable of being an asshole. And if we're going to put a percentage on it, we'd maybe say, well, depending on how much you dislike me, you might say Lloyd Evans is 90% an asshole, or 99% an asshole, or 100% an asshole. That's if you really, really dislike me. If you're one of my friends, you might say Lloyd Evans is 10% an asshole, or 5% an asshole, or even 1% an asshole. If you say I'm 0% an asshole, I'm sorry, you just don't know me well enough. You haven't given me enough opportunity to display my assholiness. But my point is that so long as I'm capable of being an asshole sometimes, it's not unfair. It's maybe a bit harsh, but it's not unfair to use that word and say, yes, he can be an asshole. That you're just being honest, okay? It's a little bit like that with religion. Religion can be full of positivity. You could have a religion where you turn up at church, nobody's judging you, nobody's trying to milk you for money, nobody is telling you that if your relatives don't believe as you do, you should ignore them, you should view them as bad association. Nobody's telling you that if you screw up, you deserve to be cast out and no one should speak to you. It's basically just a group of people who meet together and talk about their shared beliefs, and that's pretty much it. You have maybe a cup of coffee and some cake, and everyone has a great time. That's kind of the most benign model that I can think of what a religion would be. And yet, there is still some harm, because what the group is saying when they're having these meetings is not objectively true, or they are saying things that cannot be proven. Now you might say, well, what's the harm in that? What's the harm in someone who is a grown adult believing things that are not objectively true if it brings them some kind of peace, some kind of sense of fulfillment? That's a valid point, but what about the children? What about if that someone has a child, this person believes these teachings, if he or she genuinely believes these teachings, what's stopping them from passing on those teachings to their child as though they are objective facts? And I believe that practically all religions are guilty of this. So therefore, practically all religions have that element of assholism. Going back to what I was saying earlier, it's a negative, it's detrimental. And to illustrate, imagine if you sent your child to a school and you'd done your homework, you had found the school with the highest grades, the school with the most competent teachers. This is a school that wins competitions in your state. It's just one of the most sought after schools. But then after a week or two of your child going to this school, you find out that there's this bizarre tradition where the school will refer to the number 4 as 5 and will refer to the number 5 as 4. So that whenever they're in a math class, the numbers get mixed up, or if they're talking about the number 4 or the number 5 in any other subject, the numbers get switched. It's not like a massive thing, maybe, but you're going to be concerned, because when your child is then graduating and wanting to go on to college and university, they will be at a disadvantage compared to all of the other schools that don't have this problem. And that's kind of what religion's doing. It's teaching children things that they're not objectively true. And so therefore the children are at a disadvantage. Yes, they'll maybe grow out of it. Yes, they'll reach a point perhaps where their critical thinking skills are such that they can look back on what they've been taught by their parents or by their pastor and think, do I really believe that? And maybe they'll decide that they don't believe it, and maybe they'll think, oh, well, no harm done. It's not like I was, at a severe handicap through all the years that I believed these things, maybe. But I would argue that you're still at a detriment if you are using years of your existence on this planet believing something that's wrong. And that's why when I look at these definitions of cult, I can agree with bits of it. But if I were to say what my definition of cult would be, and this is purely my opinion, I think a cult needn't be a religion. I think a cult can be a pyramid scheme, it can be a political movement, it can be anything where there is a charismatic leader or group of leaders where there is harm, where harm is caused, and where the interests of the leadership are put ahead of the interests of the followers, or the followers suffer in some way due to they're following the leaders, whether the leaders are, again, religious or businessmen or politicians, whatever. That's my rather clumsy attempt at defining what a cult is. And I think that based on that, again, any religion could be considered a cult. Does that mean that I would then go around to all religious people that I see and say, you're in a cult, you're in a cult, you're in a cult? Absolutely not. I have my opinion. I think that they mean well. I think that they're sincere. I don't think they're trying to fool anyone. I don't think they're trying to lie to anyone. I don't even think that they are consciously lying to their children. But I do think that the best religion that you could imagine would still be a soft cult. I think that it's scalable. I think there's like a continuum from soft to extreme. And the best religion you could imagine would be a soft cult if it's teaching to children things that are not objectively true. So I think I've managed to get through this in one piece and somehow explain to you what my thinking is on this. And again, I absolutely recognize that lots of you will disagree. This is just the way I approach the issue. Again, I try to limit my use of the word cult, although I will use it in my videos if it fits in with what I'm saying and if it's justified, especially if I'm talking about like an extreme example of control or manipulation or abuse. How can you not use that word, whether it's an insult or not? But again, the main problem with the word cult is that it's a pejorative, it's an insult. We don't tend to use insults when we're speaking of things objectively. And it's a tricky word to use because it, again, alienates people and it makes it difficult to persuade someone who is in a cult. But we have to navigate these issues as best we can, and I hope that I've explained things to you as clearly as possible. Please do let me know what you think in the comments below, but I hope you have enjoyed this video. Please don't forget to subscribe for more videos, and as always, thank you for watching.